All right, my AP literature friends. So for this writing workshop, I'd like to take a look at FRQ 1 from the 2022 exam, which featured Richard Blanco's poem Shaving. And for those of you that are familiar with my work, I'm going to stick to the status quo. And for those of you that are just seeing my templates for the first or second time, I'll just break it down quickly for you. So what I'll do is demonstrate how my students manipulate my template in order to construct the introductory paragraph. So we'll take a look at, I think I have four exemplars for that. Each kid approaches it the exact same way. Just kind of using my template, my heuristic to guide them. And then we'll tackle the body paragraphs with something that I call the Syllogistic Method. It's an Aristotelian template that my students use across the expository modes. So we'll dive right in. Let's take a look here. So first thing I say to anyone who is interested in incorporating or embracing my templates with their students is this. And it's kind of the essential question that is the impetus for all of my work. What if we taught composition like Bob Ross teaches painting? And in brief, I just emphasize the fact that you have to position yourself as the expert writer in the classroom, just as Bob Ross is the expert painter, and get to the proverbial easel and canvas with your paints. And paint with your kids, write with them, show them plenty of exemplars and models. So if you're going to run this writing workshop, try your hand at a couple of introductions. Like show your kids how to invert the thesis, show them how to craft a first premise, show them how to manipulate the 5-word rule for the embedded quotes, etc. So I'm just a big contender of the idea that the more we model, the better students become in their ability to write. It just demystifies the process. So the more good writing they see, the better they become. So here's the prompt. In Richard Blanco's poem Shaving, published in 1998, the speaker writes about the act of shaving. Read the poem carefully, then in a well-written essay, analyze how Blanco uses literary elements and techniques to develop the speaker's complex associations with the ritual of shaving. So kind of a cool poem. I really dug this. I was happy to see this. I think it's a pretty juicy poem. So the first question we have to ask ourselves is, how do I write the introductory paragraph? And I give my students two options with regards to my template. They can declare or they can invert. But as we know, since we're performing literary analysis, my students pretty much 99.9% of the time will invert. The declarative model I reserve for rhetorical analysis. So my Lang guys use that for rhetorical analysis. And then when you get into the other expository modes of argument, persuasion, synthesis, research, it's a 50-50 split between declaring and inverting. It just depends upon how you want to tackle the prompt or the essential question. So we'll primarily for this look at the inverted. And so with that prompt, here's my contention. I think that there are two implicit questions being asked in every FRQ1 and FRQ2, and I've demonstrated this a few times in the past. The first question is this: what is the authorial intent? So why did Blanco write that poem? So what was the purpose? What's his thesis? What's his exigence? What's the main gist of the poem? So I think students need to arrive at that answer in their introduction somewhere. And then the last question is this: how does the author construct meaning? So if students answer both of those questions in the space of the introductory paragraph, they should come out of the gates pretty blazing with a good solid foundation upon which to write the rest of the essay if they've ascertained the meaning of the poem, with deliberation and accurately. So here's option 1, declarative, which we are not going to do. So we're going to invert. And in brief, It's simply you begin with the thesis, context, background, and I'll define these when we look at the inverted in just a second. Tier 2 level vocabulary, sentence constructs, and since you're using a template, there's parameters. The intro is going to be exactly 4 sentences long. And for those of you that want to do a deeper dive into the declarative, just look at any of my synthesis videos, or in particular rhetorical analysis, argument persuasion, the research stuff on my YouTube channel, and you can unpack that a little more. So for our purposes, we're going to focus on inverting. And with this, we're going to end with the thesis. And here's how I structure this. The first 3 sentences, my students are answering the question, what is the authorial intent? So the very first 3 sentences, context, background, theme. There's no need for hooks. There's no need for analogies. We're writing an academic paper, so we don't need to get cute, right? So I tell my guys, I'm not a fish. You don't need to hook me with anything. So what is the authorial intent? Last sentence, how does the author construct meaning? So again, it's going to be exactly 4 sentences. So in terms of tier 2, let me explain what I mean by that. I refer to it as tier 2 level vocabulary, which is basically your average run-of-the-mill SAT level caliber word. The idea that the kids need to keep an academic tone throughout, and use academic diction wisely. So I like to see that at play. And then sentence constructs, I've done a few videos on this, so you can go digging in my YouTube channel. I borrow an idea from Strunk and White. They have a book called Write It Right. It's free online. You can get a PDF of it. And they have something that they call rule number 18. And rule number 18 makes the assertion that there's 12 different ways to write a sentence. So you'll see my students, hopefully, with their samples, be able to manipulate their syntax for voice, rhythm, and flow, right? You couple that with the tier 2 level vocabulary, sprinkle in a little colloquial vernacular, you got it. That's the full package, right? That's what I want my students to ultimately balance out in terms of their nuance. As all of those things. And then exactly 4 sentences. So here is one example. And you'll see first 3 sentences, what is the authorial intent? Last sentence, how does the author construct meaning? So you're going to see the student focus on the terms and devices in the last sentence in order to get anchored in the thesis. So let's see where they begin here. Death is not the opposite of life, but is instead an integral and interconnected part of it. In fact, every aspect of life and living is conjoined in the sense that nothing really separates man from nature. Mere deeds like shaving and writing are woven into the great scheme of how every aspect of existence serves to remind the individual that everything is tied together. So they're focusing on that global idea that, Blanco is asserting that there's this interconnectedness of, nature to life and to our mundane everyday living. So they got it, they've expressed it as best they can. Last sentence, Blanco hits upon this concept through his extended metaphors and syntactical arrangements. So use the terms and devices there. And I tell my guys, focus on the most salient ones, like the big ones, the heavy hitters. But don't make it a literary terms dumping ground. You just don't want to dump like 6 terms in there. Like he uses tone and ethos and pathos and logos, so we see kids do that. So that's one example of how the template is operated. Here's a different student going to approach it the exact same way. What is the authorial intent? How does the author construct meaning? Everything is one. And I really like that opening. I tell my kids to be assertive, to be confident, say it concisely. Life and death are one, the river and the sea are one, and so is the act of shaving and writing. It's really good so far. I like this. When one can see how everything in life is contingent upon the other, the mundane becomes miraculous. So last sentence, drop the terms and devices. Blanco highlights this through his frequent employment of similes and syntactical arrangements. It's really well done. Simple, simple, simple to the point, right? We got to keep in mind that they have, 3 essays to write in a very limited amount of time. So you really can't tap dance around the thesis. And I think this student read the poem well. They ascertained its meaning and said it nicely. So, the sentence constructs are pretty sweet. There's flow, there's rhythm. I like the vocab in it: contingent, mundane, employment, syntactical arrangements, right? So there's very nice vocab to it without the kid sounding like a goon or, sounding contrived or pretentious. They're definitely in their wheelhouse, which is nice, and it's very academic. So here's example number 3, done the exact same way. What is the authorial intent in the first 3 moves? How does the author construct meaning? Last move. For the individual who sees how everything in life is connected, death is but the next natural segue in the grand mundane adventure. I'm realizing there's a period there instead of a comma. I should have fixed that. Apologies there. That should be a comma. That threw me off. Let me take that from the top. For the individual who sees how everything in life is connected, death is but the next natural segue in the grand mundane adventure. So ultimately, you got to get to the ha-ha moment, like the ta-da. What's Blanco doing? What's his point? And that's his message, right? Man is forever linked to the natural world. He comes from it and spends his earthly days in it and will return to it upon passing. When one can see how all the individual pieces of life link together inextricably, it can afford a lot of peace. Now, last sentence, do the same thing with the lit terms. Blanco arrives at such an epiphany through his naturalistic imagery, extended metaphor, and syntactical maneuvers. Each one done the exact same way. But here's the kicker. I know some teachers don't like it when students front load the thesis with their terms and devices. And this is a debate that the College Board has. We debate this at readings. Do kids need to say the terms and or devices in the thesis in order to articulate the thesis? It's contentious. Some say yes, some say no. Some of you have very strong opinions on that. I think there's ways to get to a thesis without saying the terms. You can imply them. So some of my students, and you'll see why in a second, based on the template of the syllogistic method, some of my students will withhold the terms and devices for what is called the first premise. And again, we'll look at that in just a second. So some of my students will go 4 sentences and only focus on authorial intent and the construction of meaning, but withhold the terms because they feel it's redundant. If they're going to talk about those terms in the first premise, there's really no need to do it up top in the thesis. And again, this is totally up for debate, and it's teacher preference. I ultimately tell my students, some of them I'll whisper in their ear and I'll be like, you got to drop the terms because you could commit the faux pas of writing like straight up Cliff Note synopsis, something that's really plot summative. So to ensure that you have a thesis, drop the terms. Some of my students that, I feel are, pretty much guaranteed to get a 4 or a 5. They're more artful and they don't need to do it. So this is an example. When one gets to pulling the threads of life, they begin to see how everything is interconnected. So they begin the same way as all the other ones we've looked at. In many regards, mankind is the sea, and the sea is this pen, and this pen is a part of the big circle of how all things are linked together in a big circle. All too often, individuals resist the natural course of life and perceive themselves as being uniquely different and separate. But as Blanco reminds us, despite all the vast separateness in life, it's all connected. So again, you don't necessarily need to have the terms, and maybe that's something we could talk about in the comments in YouTube or in Facebook, wherever you see this posted. To have the terms or not to have the terms, 'tis the question. So I think that's something the College Board is going to, continue to grapple and will wrangle for a little bit of time. So I'll leave it at teacher preference. So the next question is this: how do I write the body paragraphs? And I've alluded to it, I've hinted at it. We're going to proceed syllogistically. So this is what the syllogistic method looks like. It's ultimately when you argue from premise to conclusion. It's from the Aristotelian tradition. So Aristotle ran a school called the Lyceum, and the rich aristocratic boys would go there to learn about polemics and oration, wordsmithing, and they would throw out these, real big, juicy questions. And maybe you've read the book or are familiar with the book Plato's Republic, where the essential question of what is justice is grappled with for many pages. And basically, some philosophical think tanker steps to the mic and says, aha, I have the definition of justice. And they articulate it in syllogistic form. So premise, conclusion. And then the guys huddle up and they find all the holes in the logic and say, no, that's not a good definition of justice. We need to rethink that. You spend pages and pages and pages coming up with definitions of what is justice. So Aristotle noted that some of his students were really good at debating, and he didn't know why some were like meh and some were excellent, and some kids just tank bombed every single debate that he put them in. And he noticed that some kids have a hard time sustaining their line of reasoning. Sound familiar? Sounds like most of us composition teachers. So he funked up something called the syllogistic method. So if I were to say to you, premise 1, arsenic is deadly. Premise 2, my dog ate arsenic. Conclusion, my dog is going to die. We'd all nod our head and say, yeah, that's logical. It's cogent. That was one of the words Aristotle used, cogency, right? To be mathematical, locked in, like really bulletproof, logical. When our students write, we want them to have a certain computative approach, a systematic approach, so that they sustain their line of reasoning. And unfortunately, and we could get into sample papers and look at this, a lot of students just write second premises when they should be performing literary analysis, and that's why it's so plot heavy. They just basically regurgitate the poem. That in the poem this happened, and then this happened, and then this happened, and that's not meeting the demands of the assignment. So for the purposes of constructing a body paragraph, this is what the template looks like. The first premise is going to be an argument anchored in terms and or devices. Combine them. So ideally, I like that to be 3 sentences long. And you're going to see my student sample be 3 sentences long. I think students start quoting way too early in the body paragraph, and that's where that switch happens, where it's like, uh-oh, this is no longer literary analysis. We're writing plot synopsis. So I don't want them, tearing apart the text at language level until sentence 4. And I'll model that in a second. Premise 2 is textual support, which is the teeter-totter balance of quoting and paraphrasing. You don't want to do one more at the expense of the other. It should be balanced out. And then the conclusion, and I want to be really mindful in asserting this, the conclusion of the body paragraph, not the conclusion of the essay, is where you kind of shake hands to the first premise. I always tell my students the first premise is a promise. I promise you, dear reader, to talk about certain said things, and you shake hands with it and guarantee your promise, right? So it's like echo the thesis. It's your link. It's the keeping of your promise. So let's take a look at where this goes. First, I know one question I often get asked is, how many paragraphs do your students write on the exam? And they do an intro, 2 bodies, and a conclusion. I'm only going to show you 1 body. Basically, if the student were to continue, they would just tackle the other literary terms and devices that they haven't tackled yet in this body paragraph. And then the other question I often get is, where should a student begin their body paragraph? And I tell my students this: begin where Blanco begins, literally. in terms of like literary moves, what does Blanco do first? So you'll see my students transition with things like this, right from the onset, comma. Do you see that? So we have a chronology, we have a sequence, and that helps students sustain their line of reasoning too. It keeps them organized. So go chronologically and kind of like cross weave where needed and when necessary. So let's look at these first three sentences for the first premise. We should be using terms and devices. All right, from the onset, Blanco manipulates his syntax to highlight his theme. In stacking similes, he also reinforces the idea that life's big mystery is quite simple to understand. Everything is connected to the laws of nature and the natural order of things. Even his reflections upon his father's life while shaving belong to this sense of connection. So one of the things I do during writing workshops is I'll pause and I'll say to the student, put that first premise in terms of a promise. What do you promise me? And I'm expecting that we're going to be talking about syntax and similes and the reflection upon the father. If we're going to talk about anything else, we're going to break our line of reasoning. We can't bring in anything extraneous. And if we're going to keep our promise, we have to talk about those things. So go chronologically, right? The student mentioned syntax first up top. Let's get at it. Look at where they go. Fourth sentence starts the second premise. Get quoting. Immediately, Blanco conjoins the first two clauses with a comma splice. He informs us that he is not shaving, he's writing about it. The comma splice is an interesting feature because it cues the reader to the idea that Blanco is likewise going to connect everything to highlight the gist of his theme. Right? So the quotes need to be germane to the promise. Right? We talked about syntax up top, and that quote, the paraphrase, and the analysis is all linking. So we're talking about syntax. Let's move on. The hyphen gives way to a long series of similes that show how even something as mundane as shaving and writing are like ocean steam rising from clouds, and ultimately the same silent forces that quietly orchestrated his father's life in passing. So I go on to the next screen here. But I want to talk about something. I call it the 5-word rule. My students, come time of the exam, most of them are pretty good at embedding their quotes and can keep their quotes sounding conversational. I don't want to hear abrupt transitions. And typically this works. It's not 100% bulletproof, but if a student places a minimum of 5 words in front of the quote, so a minimum, not exactly, a minimum of 5 words in front of the quote and keeps the quote small, it should sound conversational. But note how in that one sentence, the student is quoting 3 separate times in one line. That's really talented. That's tough to pull off. So my students, I do a lot of Bob Rossing to get them to do that. That's how you get to like real good language level analysis. All right, so we got to move on. Blanco, with a contemplative and musing tone, is beginning to see that the discrete mystery of how whiskers grow is really the same thread to explain the drink roses take from the vase. Things in life just happen like the bloom of spiderwebs each morning, but all too often one does not pause long enough to take notice of how everything in life is like one gigantic jigsaw piece. All right, so this student analyzed the similes and the syntax. It's what all the quotes and paraphrases are about. And it's connected to that first premise. So the line of reasoning is pretty good. I wish there was more analysis in here. I'll say that. It's a little slight, but you're seeing how the template is, manipulated. There definitely could be a little more analysis. These, like that spider quote, just kind of got left there. So that's something that I would extend if the student were to revise. In acknowledging his own mortality, Blanco is beginning to see that these simple acts like shaving and writing likewise mark the days of his father's life. There's an intensity to vanishing, but knowing that life is fleeting and impermanent is comforting given that everything belongs to a divine order. So one of the things I forgot to say when we were looking at the syllogistic method is students often ask me, how many sentences should a body paragraph be? And I think that's a really good question. I don't think we talk about that enough. So those little itty bitty 4, 5, 6 sentence baggers that we sometimes get, I don't think there's enough analysis and support in there to fully substantiate and prove the argument. So I tell my students to shoot for 10 sentences, kind of cap it at 12. Otherwise, you're going to probably bloviate and go wayward, get plot heavy, and deviate from the demand of the assignment a little bit. So 10 to 12 is what I tell my guys to do. All right, so that's FRQ1 from 2022, Blanco shaving. So I hope you found that useful and can use it with your students. If you want the slides that you're looking at that are featured here, you can email me at teachingwritingcoach@gmail.com. Just identify in your email what you want, and I will pass that on to you. And then to wrap things up, I'll tell you about a couple irons I have in the fire. So first things first, I think some of you know that I'll be presenting in the fall in Anaheim with Tim Freitas and Brandon Abden. So we'll be out there collaborating together. And then I'm working starting this summer with the National Writing Project as a lead teacher. I'm going to be doing some professional development through them. So stay tuned for that. Basically going to run like a 5-week course through them. Perfection Learning I'm working with as well. So once a month, usually towards the latter end of the month, I'll be hosting a webinar with them. And then I'm putting together a textbook around my essential question. What if we taught composition like Bob Ross teaches painting? And I'm offering a course called the Teach It Right 5-Week Mastermind, where basically I'm working with teachers to equip them with my templates, my methodologies, my alternative grading methods, my Plato's Plato discussion, modality, my Nuance Academy, my Word Study Academy, the whole kit and caboodle, just equipping and training. And if you're interested in working together in the coming weeks or months, then you can visit my webpage at teachinghowtowrite.com. There's information there. Or, as always, just feel free to reach out to me and we can have a conversation. So I really do truly hope that was helpful and gives you an idea of how one way to tackle writing a poetry essay. Take care.